Let's get rid of them. The Ottoman Empire, there are a lot of people there who are like, well, let's have a Turkish nationalist movement. The Ottoman Empire really should be clear that we're a state for the Turks. Egypt says, no, you're not. We're Arab, so if you're for the Turks, then we're Arab. We should leave the Ottoman Empire, be independent too. So nationalist movements there. So those are our three kind of echoes of the Atlantic Revolution. But now, it's time to move on to the biggest story of the era, which is what? Industrialization. Yeah, and nothing says industrialization like a big fat steam engine. So there we go. Remember, this is the change, the big change in human history, where people stopped making things mostly by, and started making things mostly by, in, that's right. And our power sources went from being things like wind and burning wood and using water power, and more than anything else, using human and animal muscle, to using what kind of fuels? Fossil fuels of various sorts. A big transition. And then the third kind of leg of the stool of the Industrial Revolution or industrialization was how fast technology changed, right? I mean, think about communication technologies. It took 5,000 years to go from that to that, but only 160 years to go from that to that, right? This is how much faster our technology accelerates since industrialization. Where did industrialization begin? Britain saw the first place where people were making things by machine in factories and using fossil fuels to power themselves in their lives, and seeing this rapid acceleration in technology that we've come accustomed to in the last 200 years. Let's remember why that was. Let's remember that Britain was the site of what sometimes is called a second agricultural revolution, with farming becoming more efficient, more food supplies, and food supplies going up means what else is going up generally? Population. Population is going up. In Britain, where did those new people move to? Cities. And you'll remember our two inventors, Richard Arkwright. What was his invention? No, that's James Watt with the steam engine. So remember James Watt with the steam engine. Using the spinning, the machine spinning wheel thing, right? Which could be powered by fossil fuel, by a steam engine, right? To spin thread and therefore make shirts in vast quantities. So it's good to kind of remember those guys. And a lot of people who were those new extra people in Britain gathering in cities, urbanization as a fuel for industrialization. That was good, of course, for Richard Arkwright, because now he has lots of workers for his cloth factories and lots of customers all in one place. But of course, if you're going to use fossil fuels and build steam engines, what are two natural resources you're going to need? Coal, a fossil fuel, and iron to make the steel out of, to make the machinery from. Hey, what luck! Britain had both in pretty large quantities. To say nothing of the canals that they had to move stuff around the country. Good if you're Richard Arkwright or James Watt and you need to move coal or thread or cotton or shirts around the country fast to industrialize. So population up, urbanization up, coal and iron and canals and rivers to move everything around. Oh, and what else did Britain have access to?
Colonies.
Colonies! And what could they provide? Yeah, like that, right? What's that? So Britain dominating trade there on the Atlantic Ocean, had access to things like cotton and other raw materials like indigo, good for making shirts. So that was advantageous for them. But perhaps the most interesting thing that they had they also had a what kind of system set up to move money around, investment, banking system. But perhaps most important, property rights and patent protection. Here's the English Bill of Rights that guaranteed the rights to your property, including your ideas. And why was that super helpful to James Watt and Richard Arkwright? Say that again, Alan? They're the only ones who get the profit from their invention if they invent it, which makes it more likely they're actually going to invent it. Patents really did fuel industrialization, right? Because you could invent something new, like a steam engine, or a cotton spinning machine, or a power weaving machine, or a refrigeration machinery, like my great-great-grandfather, and you get the profit from it. So, a lot more invention happening when there's patents and property rights. By the way, all this stuff feeds into what economic system that actually Britain and much of the West had developed by the year 1750? Capitalism. Capitalism. So, remember this. Capitalism is a system of private ownership, corporations, free trade, entrepreneurship, and investment to make a profit. through such methods as joint stock companies and stock exchanges, facilitated industrial development in the West. And, by the way, eventually Japan. When Richard Arkwright wanted to find investors, he could do that. If he wanted to, he could start a corporation, go to the stock market and say, who wants to buy stock in my weaving company? And investors would invest. He'd get the money he needs to make a weaving factory. They'd get money back when the weaving factory did well. Entrepreneurship, he could actually start a business on his own and have it protected by the government. All this stuff helped make industrialization move much more quickly. And let's note some general patterns that go along with industrialization. Not just in Britain, and in fact not just in the West, but also in this era. What's the one other place on earth outside of the West that industrializes pretty thoroughly? Japan. So in this era we're really talking about North America, Europe, and Japan. But these are patterns that happen more and more. New patterns of work based on specialization of labor. Here you can see in this primary source picture of a 19th century American factory. You can see this guy here is probably management, right? It's his job to manage the workers. Maybe he's an accountant and it's his job to keep track of the work. You can tell he's not a working class guy because he's wearing this fancy bowler hat that says, I'm not working class. These guys look a little more working class. That guy in particular looks a little resentful, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
He looks a little salty. And they were specialized in doing various jobs, right? Where you would maybe stand in front of that machine and do nothing but, run that machine for 12 hours a day. Factory system. We'll keep in mind that social structure changed in these industrializing societies. That rural peasant class declined in relative numbers and importance, right? By 1850, Britain is the first society ever in human history where more people live in towns than they do in the countryside. That's because of industrialization. We'll keep in mind that the position of old elites is challenged. The aristocracy in Britain no longer dominates the economy like they once did. Now the economy is dominated by new elites, like business owners, capitalists, like Richard Arkwright, for example. They don't have the power they used to, the old British aristocracy. The industrial working class, like these folks here in Paris, they grow in numbers, of course, as the society industrializes, and so does a middle class and what we might call an ownership class. What Karl Marx called the bourgeoisie, right? The middle class, the accountants, the secretaries, the engineers, that get paid decent wages to make this new industrial economy work. But it's not just social classes that change a lot. What's another kind of social divide that sees a lot of change and reshuffling, if you will, during the time of industrialization? Race, actually less so than in a lot of ways than something else. What's another social divide? Family is related to family structure.
Religion.
Jen, thank you, Elena. Yeah, that's always the number one thing. If you're ever asked to write about social structure, you should always go to gender first. That's the easiest thing to do. So family structure and gender roles change as well. For example, it's this interesting thing where lower class young women, like these ones in Japan in the late 19th century, they're the ones who take many of the jobs in textile mills. And that's important because every time industrialization has ever happened, from Britain 250 years ago to Bangladesh now, what's the first industry that's always industrialized in any given society? Textile. So early on in industrialization, women almost everywhere get a lot of the factory jobs where they can actually go and do what? Yeah, earn money for themselves, even though they're women. I know, isn't that a shocker? Less of a shocker, perhaps, what life is like for middle-class women. Do you remember that cult of domesticity thing? Yeah. What does that say if you're a middle-class woman in Britain or France or Germany or the United States, and your husband has a good middle-class job being the accountant? Stay at home and do what? Take care of the children.
Wash dishes.
Well, no, supervise the servants who are washing the dishes. But yeah, you got to supervise the servants washing the dishes and plan the meals, right? So in a sense, it kind of reinforces the patriarchal expectations for women, for families who are wealthy enough to afford to have women at home. And that nuclear family. Look, there's that nuclear family. Who was that in your class, Arvin? Do you remember who that was?
I think that was Carl.
Carl, yeah.
And Alina?
No.
No.
You're not talking Max Stein.
Oh yeah, Cynthia and Carl, yeah. Yeah, and Max and who?
Oh, is it Max Stein?
Oh yeah, it was Natalie. That was Natalie. Yeah, Marco died at the factory. But they were all moving into these more nuclear families, right? They became more the pattern as people moved out of their rural villages into the cities. That people were living more with their nuclear families, mom, dad, kids, not the whole extended family. Andrew.
Wait, where does nuclear families come from again? Like
Well, think about the nucleus, right, of a cell. The parents are in the middle and the kids around. That's actually where it comes from. And of course, there's a lot of social problems. We looked at this picture. Yeah, that's Max, right? Yeah.
no, wasn't that Anjan? Anjan got his hand.
Oh yeah, Anjan just died. Marco got.
So he's that little kid standing there.
Yeah, I think so, right? And there were a lot of problems. You guys read about this, primary sources, the long work hours, the unsafe conditions, the terrible living conditions in the cities, the sewers and or the lack of sewers, and the pollution. Bad situations that arise for a lot of people out of industrialization. There's our picture of a crowded, polluted, diseased London in the 19th century. And there were different responses to this. You might remember this guy. Remember who this guy was? Close. Adam Smith, yeah. And some people had kind of a conservative response to this. Classical liberalism supported, traditional free market capitalism and kind of said, if you have a problem with your factory, just go work in a different factory. If you don't like the way that you're being paid, then go find a better job. So the conservative response kind of said, whatever problems exist with industrial capitalism, they can be solved over time by industrial capitalism. All right, who's this guy? He brought us the radical response and kind of two ideas of what would happen. First of all, he predicted things are going to get so bad in the industrialized West that inevitably there's going to be a violent revolution led by the proletariat, after which what would come along? Socialism first, he said. So we're going to have a stage, Karl Marx predicted, of what we call socialism, where the government, run by the proletariat, run by the working class, a working class government, is going to seize control of the factories and the mines and the roads and the railroads and rearrange the economy so that it benefits the workers, not just the owners and the bourgeoisie. He said, socialism first. And then, he predicted, would come what? Communism. Or sometimes referred to as Marxist socialism, which is community ownership. Once everything is worked out fairly, he said, then we don't need a government anymore, because everyone will be able to get what they need, and everyone will know how to contribute fairly to the society. It'll be perfect, said Karl Marx, ignoring human nature entirely. And in fact, what happened was neither of those things. There were things done to try to fix up the problems of industrialization, but they weren't what he said. Instead, it was a whole series of more moderate reforms that actually did happen. For example, unionization was legalized in Britain, the United States, and other societies. People could form unions, workers could form unions, they could negotiate with their employers for higher pay. If necessary, they could even go on strike for higher pay and better conditions. Democracy was expanded to the working class just about everywhere. The United States, Germany, Japan, Britain, remember, passed a series of reform acts gradually giving all men, including the working class, the right to vote. And when working class people can vote, what kind of laws does the government pass then? Sanitation laws, cleaning up the cities and the factories.
Weekend rights.
Weekend laws, guaranteeing you get time off every single week. Wage rights, minimum wages, so everyone gets paid at least something. All those kinds of things happen when working class people get the right to elect their members of the government, like Parliament here. Other social reforms. Workplace safety standards, right? Making sure that the machines can't just be like open. They have to be covered up with like shields to keep the work, to keep Anjan's hand from getting caught in there again. That's important. Urban reforms, police forces, parks, sewers, clean water supplies, all those things that make big working class cities. Quick, name me a working class industrial city. Manchester. New York to a certain extent. Liverpool. London to a certain extent. That made these places decent places to live. And public education, of course, which not only makes people literate and therefore better employees, but also gives you some social mobility. So maybe you too can become the accountant at the factory if you know how to do math and can read and write. So all these things are kind of some reforms that happen. Industrialization looked different in different places. For example, let's keep in mind that in the United States, it was similar to Britain. There was private entrepreneurship with some government support of industrialization in the United States. Unlike everywhere in Europe, the United States never really had a big socialist movement. There were never a lot of people advocating that a system of socialism be put into place, partly because the working class was kind of divided in the United States. What was a big divide in the United States then and now? Race, right? So there were a lot of working class black people and working class white people, and maybe if the working class white people had worked together with the working class black people, they would have tried to move towards socialism more, but they didn't want to. And it was just a wealthier place. Like even working class people in the United States were better off than anywhere else on earth, really. So there was less call for radical approaches like socialism. Let's see, where was there actually the most calls for socialism?
Russia.
Russia, the Russian Empire. Look, those guys are pretty pissed off, don't they? And so do those guys. And Russia was the one place where there was more of a socialist movement, perhaps because industrialization was kind of most miserable there. Remember that industrialization in Russia was more than in Western Europe, and certainly more than in the United States, kind of driven by the government, the leaders of the government. Remember, at this time, Russia was still an absolute monarchy. The tsars or emperors of Russia still were absolute monarchs. And some of them, like Alexander II, who also ended serfdom. Remember serfdom?
Oh, yeah.
Remember how, what's a serf? If you're a serf, what's your life like?
Yeah.
You're a